The sun dipped low, casting a soft, golden glow over the small church as the wedding ceremony unfolded. Eleanor stood at the altar, trembling. Her heart pounded in her chest, but not from excitement. No, this was not a day of joy. The whole town was watching, and she could feel their pity washing over her like a wave. A whisper of judgment hung in the air, unspoken but thick, as she stood there, dressed in a borrowed gown that did little to hide the exhaustion and sadness etched into her face. She was 32, unmarried, and still struggling to make ends meet as a schoolteacher. The label Old Maid clung to her, heavier than the wedding dress she wore. Every eye in the church seemed to weigh her down, but there was one face beside her that seemed colder than the rest. Cole Brennan stood at her side, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He was a man of few words, a man who had built an empire from nothing, and today it seemed he was as distant as ever. There was no warmth in his gaze, no joy in his presence. His hand, when it brushed against hers to slide the wedding band onto her finger, trembled slightly. Eleanor caught it, though she didn't know if it was from nerves or something deeper. He remained silent, his lips pressed into a firm line, his demeanor distant, as though he were miles away. The minister finished the ceremony with a few final words, and the crowd murmured their approval, but it all felt wrong. Eleanor wanted to flee, but there was nowhere to go. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the pity in their eyes or the quiet weight of her own desperation. But what the townspeople didn't know was that Cole Brennan had waited 12 years for this moment. 12 long years of quiet longing, of hidden affection, and unspoken love. He had planned this, every part of it. The truth he kept buried inside him was one that could change everything. The door of the church swung open as Eleanor and Cole stepped into the light. The cold, biting wind stung her cheeks, and for a moment she could almost forget about the weight of her wedding band. But then she caught sight of something in the distance. Her reflection in the stained glass window, distorted and pale, like a ghost of the woman she had once been. 3 weeks earlier, the memory of that day was still fresh in Eleanor's mind when she'd received the letter from her landlord. The notice was as cold and final as the hand that had slipped it under her door. You are hereby notified that the bank is foreclosing on the property, and your rent will be tripled effective immediately. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The words were harsh, and they hit her like a blow to the gut. She had nowhere to go. Her savings were modest, barely enough to keep her in the small boarding house where she had lived for the past few years. She was alone in the world, save for the children she taught every day, but even they couldn't provide a place to stay. As she read the letter over and over, a deep sense of dread took root inside her. She couldn't afford to move, couldn't afford anything. Her heart sank, and she thought for the first time in years that she might be truly out of options. She was just another orphan schoolteacher in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. But there was one woman who would change everything. Mrs. Hartwell, one of the wealthier women in town, had taken it upon herself to organize what she called an intervention for Eleanor. The ladies of the town gathered at Mrs. Hartwell's house, their faces grim with concern, but also with a certain air of satisfaction. They had a solution, a way to solve Eleanor's problem and, in their minds, rescue her from her unfortunate circumstances. Miss Marsh, Mrs. Hartwell began with that tone of authority only she could manage. We've been talking, and we believe we have a way to help you. You see, Cole Brennan is in need of a respectable wife for a business arrangement. His land deal requires it, and it would be mutually beneficial for both of you. Eleanor's stomach twisted. A business arrangement? She repeated, disbelief seeping into her voice. Mrs. Hartwell continued, undeterred. It's simple, really. You'll marry him, of course, but it will be strictly business. There's no need for emotional attachment. It will be good for him, and it will solve your housing problem. The weight of the situation settled on her shoulders like a mountain. She was being offered up like a lamb to the slaughter, an old maid, no longer seen as a woman worthy of love, but a solution to someone else's problem. A part of her wanted to refuse to cry out that she was more than a charity case. But another part, the part that was terrified of becoming homeless, the part that needed to survive, simply nodded in resignation. The next day, Eleanor met Cole Brennan at his sprawling ranch, an imposing place that seemed to stretch on forever. His land was vast, his wealth apparent in the way the house gleamed under the midday sun. He was waiting for her on the porch, tall and stiff, his expression impassive. He was nothing like the gentleman she remembered from 12 years ago. The man she'd once seen from a distance, who had seemed shy and earnest, now appeared cold and distant. Their meeting was brief and to the point. Cole offered her the terms: separate bedrooms, no expectations of romance, just a business partnership. "This is business, Miss Marsh," he said, his voice flat and unyielding. Nothing more. Eleanor felt the sting of humiliation once again. But what could she do? The reality of her situation was sinking in. She had no choice but to agree. As she turned to leave, she caught something out of the corner of her eye, an old photograph on a table near the door. It was of a harvest festival 12 years ago. She was in the background, laughing with a child. But it wasn't the picture that caught her attention. It was the fact that Cole had it. Why did he have this photograph? She couldn't shake the question, and as she stepped outside into the cold, a shiver ran down her spine. Something about this arrangement wasn't what it seemed. Little did she know, the truth about Cole Brennan's feelings for her had been hidden for 12 long years, and the journey they were about to embark on would change both of their lives forever. It was the morning of the wedding, and Eleanor stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The borrowed gown hung limply on her frame, and she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She wasn't sure if it was the dullness in her eyes or the weight of the situation, but everything about this day felt wrong. She was about to marry a man she barely knew, a man who had been nothing more than a distant figure in her life for the last several weeks. Cole Brennan's face flashed in her mind. Cold, distant, and impersonal. The town had been talking for days, whispering about her marriage to the prosperous rancher, but no one knew what had truly brought them to this moment. As she stood in the silence of the room, the words of Mrs. Hartwell echoed in her mind. "This is a business arrangement, Miss Marsh." Nothing more. The door opened, and one of the women from the town entered, fussing over her. "Oh, you look lovely. Mr. Brennan is a fine man," she said, trying to offer some comfort. But Eleanor could feel the pity in her tone, the undercurrent of judgment that seemed to follow her everywhere. She wasn't even sure if Cole wanted her to be here, let alone wanted to marry her. He hadn't said much since their first meeting, offering her terms, separate rooms, no expectations of affection, like they were discussing the sale of property. It was as though he saw her as a mere solution to a problem, something to fill a gap in his life, not someone he truly desired. The ceremony itself was a blur. Eleanor walked down the aisle, her heart sinking with every step. The town watched with open curiosity, their faces a mixture of sympathy and satisfaction, as though they were pleased to finally see the old maid off the market. As she reached the altar, she stole a glance at Cole. He was standing stiffly, his face impassive, his eyes fixed ahead. There was no warmth, no hint of the love she had imagined. He didn't look at her with affection. Instead, he looked as though he were marking a task off a to-do list. The minister began, and the words felt hollow, like echoes in the distance. "Do you take this man?" Eleanor barely heard the words as her mind raced. Was this really happening? Was she truly standing here, marrying a man she barely knew, for reasons that felt so far removed from love? Her hand trembled as Cole's cold fingers touched hers, slipping the ring onto her finger. When he placed the ring, his hand trembled slightly. Eleanor caught it, but said nothing. His gaze was still hard to read. and she wondered for a fleeting moment if the tremor meant something more. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than she understood. But the moment passed, and the ceremony concluded with polite applause. The crowd murmured their congratulations, but Eleanor could barely hear them. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, her breath shallow and uneven. It wasn't until after the ceremony, when they were walking out of the church, that she noticed the strange stillness in the air. The cold wind cut through the warmth of the church, and as she glanced up at the crowd, she saw the pity and curiosity reflected in their eyes. They didn't know the truth, of course. They didn't know the secret Cole had kept for 12 long years. As they left the church and made their way toward the carriage, Eleanor caught sight of something strange, a photograph on a small table in the hallway. It was an old photograph, faded with age. She recognized herself in the background, laughing with a child at a harvest festival 12 years ago. But what caught her attention was the fact that Cole had this photograph. She had never seen him there, never thought he'd paid attention to her. And yet, here it was, an image of her from a time when she hadn't known him at all. The question lingered in her mind, but there was no time to ask. The carriage ride to the ranch was quiet. The walls of the carriage seemed to close in on her, her thoughts spinning with confusion and doubt. She had agreed to this arrangement, but now that it was happening, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something about Cole's cold demeanor, his detached behavior, didn't sit right. Why had he waited all these years? Was this truly just a business arrangement for him? Or was there something more that he wasn't telling her? As they arrived at the ranch, Cole's massive estate loomed in front of her, a stark reminder of his wealth and success. The house was grand, the land stretching as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful, impressive, and completely overwhelming. Cole led her inside, his manner still distant, formal, and cold. He showed her to her room, a large, well-furnished space with a fireplace and a breathtaking view of the mountains. It was perfect in every way, but there was something unsettling about it. The room felt too perfect, too tailored to her tastes. How did he know what she liked? How did he know her favorite books, the kind of furniture she preferred? She didn't have time to ask, for he was already gone, leaving her alone in the room. As she wandered around, her eyes landed on the small writing desk by the window, a stack of books neatly arranged beside it. Each one had an inscription on the inside cover, for EM. Her heart skipped a beat. She recognized the initials immediately, hers. But she had never received these books. She had never seen them before. They were gifts, carefully chosen, carefully kept. But why? Why had he kept them for so long? Why had he chosen to give them to her now? Eleanor's mind raced as she reached down to touch the top book in the pile. As she did, she noticed something else, something small tucked away behind the dresser. She reached down and pulled out a delicate handkerchief, embroidered with her initials. It was worn, faded with age, but unmistakable. She had lost it years ago, back at the harvest festival. How did he have it? Why had he kept it? Her breath caught in her throat. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but she didn't know what it all meant. Why had Cole kept all these things? Was this all just a coincidence, or was there something deeper going on here? The answers were out of reach, but one thing was clear. This was no simple business arrangement. There was more to Cole Brennan than she had ever imagined, and she was about to discover the truth, whether she was ready for it or not. The first week of marriage passed in an awkward blur. Every morning, Eleanor woke early to teach the children, her mind heavy with the strange, unsettling arrangement she had agreed to. Cole remained distant, his routine predictable, leaving before dawn, returning long after dark, avoiding her at all costs. The house felt vast and cold, and though they shared a roof, it felt like they were strangers to one another. Breakfasts were silent affairs, with Cole hardly touching his food, his eyes always fixed somewhere far beyond her. The women of the town, however, were quick to visit, arriving in pairs to check on her, offering their congratulations. But there was always that underlying curiosity beneath their smiles, as if they were waiting for her to crack, to admit the truth of what they all believed, that this marriage was nothing but a mercenary arrangement. Eleanor could feel their pity seeping through their kind words. She had become a spectacle, the woman who had been saved by a wealthy man, a charity case that no one truly understood. She had hoped that her teaching would provide some comfort, but even there, the questions came. The children would ask her if she was happy, if she liked her new life, their innocent curiosity somehow more painful than the pitying looks of the town ladies. As the days passed, Eleanor tried to bury the discomfort she felt in the silence of the house, but it was becoming harder and harder to ignore. It wasn't just Cole's coldness that bothered her. It was the feeling that she was being watched. There were moments when she caught him staring at her from a distance, his gaze so intense that it made her skin prickle. He would quickly look away whenever she noticed, but the strange intensity lingered in the air between them. She had no idea what to make of it, but it unsettled her in ways she couldn't explain. It wasn't until one afternoon, when a sudden rainstorm caught her on her ride home from school, that she saw a side of Cole she hadn't expected. She had been caught in the downpour without an umbrella, her clothes quickly soaked through, the cold rain clinging to her skin. As she made her way through the muddy path, she heard the sound of hooves behind her, and before she could react, Cole appeared, riding up beside her with his coat held out to shield her from the rain. "You'll catch cold, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft, his brow furrowed in concern. For the first time, he used her name, and it made her heart skip a beat. She couldn't remember a time when he had ever spoken to her with such warmth, such genuine concern. His hand reached out, offering her the coat, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. She accepted it without thinking, feeling the warmth of his body radiating through the fabric. As they rode side by side, he kept a careful distance, but his gaze was focused on her with an intensity that made her feel both protected and strangely vulnerable. "I've been worried about you," he added, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I know your route home from school." Eleanor's heart tightened in her chest. How did he know her exact route? Was he watching her every day? She had always believed that Cole was a man of action, of business, but now she wondered if there was more to his interest in her than just a business arrangement. As the rain subsided, Cole's demeanor shifted back to its usual coldness. "You're safe now," he said, his voice returning to its usual clipped tone. "I'll see you inside." And with that, he turned and rode off, leaving Eleanor standing in the rain, her heart racing with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. That night, as she sat alone in her room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She decided to search through her room again, hoping to uncover some answers. As she went through the drawers and shelves, she found a stack of books hidden behind the armoire, each one inscribed with the letters for Yem. They were all books she would have loved, poetry, literature, and even teaching guides she had once dreamed of having. Each book was carefully selected, as though someone had known exactly what she would want. And that someone, she realized with a sudden jolt, was Cole. He had been buying her these books for years. But why? Why hadn't he given them to her? What was the reason for all this secrecy? Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. Had he been watching her all these years, buying gifts for her without ever revealing his intentions? The idea made her feel both uncomfortable and strangely touched. But the unease lingered. The more she thought about it, the more questions arose, none of them with easy answers. Then, on the night of the town's Founders' Day celebration, the next uncomfortable moment arrived. As the music began to play, Eleanor stood by the refreshment table, watching the couples dance, feeling like a spectator in her own life. It was then that she caught sight of Cole across the room. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. His face softened just slightly, his usual stoicism faltering for the briefest second. He walked toward her, his jaw tight, and his hands fisted at his sides as though he were struggling with something inside. "May I have this dance, Eleanor?" His voice was rough, almost pleading, and Eleanor was taken aback. For a moment, she couldn't speak, her heart pounding in her chest. This was not the cold, distant man she had married. It was something else. She could see it in his eyes, the vulnerability, the desire. But what did this all mean? Why had he waited so long to speak up? As they moved to the dance floor, she could feel the tension between them, the unspoken emotions that neither of them knew how to express. The dance was slow, their bodies close, but not touching. His hand rested lightly on her waist, and she could feel the tremor in his fingers. She couldn't tell if it was fear, desire, or was something else entirely. But as the song came to an end, Cole quickly released her, stepping back as though he couldn't bear the closeness any longer. Eleanor stood there, confused and unsettled, wondering what was going on beneath the surface of this strange marriage. She could no longer ignore the truth that was beginning to unfold around her. Cole had been waiting for something, waiting for her, but for what? The answers were just out of reach, and she knew she needed to find them. But what if the truth was too much to bear? The moment Cole took her hand to lead her onto the dance floor, Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The music played softly, a waltz that seemed to hang in the air, full of unspoken tension. She had danced with men before, at social events and gatherings, but this was different. The way Cole's hand settled on her waist, with a gentleness that betrayed the cold distance he had shown her all week, sent a ripple of confusion through her. His touch was surprisingly tender, and yet she could feel the restraint in his fingers. He wasn't holding her like a man who had just married, but like someone holding something precious, something fragile. As they swayed together, Eleanor found herself strangely aware of the space between them, the delicate line that separated them both. It wasn't just the physical space, though. It was something deeper, something neither of them could bridge easily. His eyes avoided hers, his gaze focusing on something beyond her, as though he were memorizing the moment. Eleanor tried to catch his gaze, but each time she did, he looked away quickly. It was as if the very act of touching her was too much for him to handle, and yet he couldn't stop himself. As the music drew to a close, Eleanor's chest tightened with confusion and curiosity. Cole released her hand almost immediately, stepping back with a swift, almost mechanical motion, his face expressionless once more. Eleanor stood there for a moment, wondering if the warmth she had felt earlier was just an illusion. Had it meant anything at all? Or had she misread the signals? The crowd around them clapped politely, but it felt distant, like the applause was for something they had all expected to happen, not something genuine. She watched as Cole turned away, retreating into the crowd with a hasty, almost desperate stride. Eleanor stood frozen on the dance floor, her mind swirling. What just happened? Was that moment of tenderness real, or had it been some form of emotional restraint she didn't understand? Her questions lingered in the air, unanswered, and for the first time, she realized she had no idea who the man she had married truly was. As she made her way to the refreshment table, her thoughts were interrupted by the hushed voices of two old ranchers standing nearby. They didn't notice her approach, their conversation casual, yet their words felt like a slap to her face. "Brennan finally got his girl," one man said, his voice low. The other man laughed softly, the sound tinged with something darker. "Took him long enough. Been mooning over that schoolteacher since '76, they say. Heard he bought that boarding house years ago. Kept her rent low on purpose. Let her think it was just bad luck with the bank, but he was pulling the strings the whole time." Eleanor's heart stopped. She froze, her hand still holding a glass of punch that suddenly felt like dead weight. They kept talking, unaware of her presence. Man's been building his empire for 12 years. Also, he could have her. Buying land, building wealth, just waiting for her to notice him. And now, here she is, standing next to him like some prize to be claimed. Eleanor's stomach churned, a wave of nausea sweeping over her. She felt dizzy, her breath shallow. All this time, the whispers of the town had been true. Cole had been orchestrating this. He had been waiting for her, watching her, manipulating the circumstances to ensure she had nowhere else to go but into his arms. The pieces clicked into place with a harsh, painful clarity. He had known all along that she would never accept charity, so he had given her no choice. She wasn't just a woman rescued by a wealthy man. She was a woman who had been trapped by his planning, by his schemes, and by his unspoken obsession. The realization hit her like a wave, and she struggled to breathe through the rising panic. Her fingers tightened around the glass, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek, though she didn't know when it had started. She had never thought of Cole as anything more than a distant, business-minded man, but now she saw him for what he truly was, someone who had been willing to bend the world to his will to claim her as his own. He hadn't just bought the boarding house. He had bought her future. He had bought her freedom, and she had never even known it. The rancher's words echoed in her mind, the cruelty in their voices like a sharp knife twisting in her gut. She wasn't the woman he loved. She was the woman he had patiently, quietly, and systematically claimed. Just as she was about to turn and leave the table, her thoughts spinning out of control, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Eleanor," Cole said softly, his voice tense. She turned to face him, her heart pounding, and there he stood, his face betraying nothing of the turmoil that churned inside her. "Can we talk?" he asked. She wanted to scream at him, to demand the answer she needed, but instead, she nodded stiffly, her throat tight. As he led her away from the crowd, she could feel the weight of his presence, the space between them thick with unspoken words. She didn't know what she was about to hear, but she knew one thing for certain. The truth was finally coming, whether she was ready for it or not. And it was going to change everything. That night, after the harsh sting of the revelation at the refreshment table, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with the words of the ranchers, the realization of what Cole had done, what he had orchestrated to bring her to this point. It felt like she had been played, a puppet in a game she didn't even know she was part of. The man she had married, the man who had seemed distant and cold, was not who she thought he was. There was so much more to him, to this whole arrangement, than she could ever have imagined. But just as she was about to spiral into a frenzy of confusion and anger, the door to her room opened quietly. Cole stepped inside, his face pale, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't name. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice cracking slightly. "I think it's time you know the whole truth." She looked up at him, her chest tight with a mix of frustration, fear, and something else, something softer. "What truth?" she asked, her voice shaky but firm. Cole walked toward her, a worn leather journal in his hands. He held it out to her, and without a word, she took it from him, the weight of it surprising in her hands. "This is where it all started," he said quietly. "You deserve to know everything. All of it. If you want to leave after you read it, I'll understand. But you deserve the truth." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Eleanor alone with the journal in her hands. She sat down at the desk, staring at the worn cover. The leather was cracked and faded, as though it had seen years of wear, and the weight of it seemed to press down on her heart. She opened it slowly, the pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was neat, careful, but there was a rawness to it that spoke of deep emotion. As she began to read, the years between her and Cole seemed to disappear, and she was transported back to a time she had never known. The first entry she read was from September 15th, 1876. "Saw her at the schoolhouse today. She was teaching the children to sing. I stood outside like a fool just listening. She has the most beautiful voice. I'm too rough, too poor, too nothing for someone like her." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea that Cole had been watching her from the very beginning, that he had been there hidden in the background all those years ago. It was painful to read, yet something in her heart stirred as she imagined him, standing outside, watching her with a longing she had never known. She continued reading, and the entries became more frequent, more desperate. October 3rd, 1876. She dropped her handkerchief at the festival. I picked it up, meant to return it, but she'd already gone. I kept it. I know I shouldn't have. It smells like lilac. The words made her heart ache. The handkerchief, the one she had lost that day, the one she had thought was gone forever, was in his possession all this time. He had kept it all these years as a symbol of something he could never have. March 12th, 1878, left Blackwater Ridge today. Can't bear watching her from the shadows anymore. I'll make my fortune. Someday, I'll be worthy of her. Someday. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read. The pain in his words was evident, and she couldn't help but wonder how much he had suffered all these years, waiting for a chance to prove himself worthy of her. It was a side of him she had never known, a side he had kept hidden, buried under layers of pride and restraint. She turned the pages, each one revealing more of the truth. June 18th, 1882, bought my first 100 acres. Still not enough. She deserves more than a struggling rancher can give. April 9th, 1884, returned to town briefly. Saw Eleanor teaching. She looked tired. Discovered her boarding house had a leaking roof, broken windows. Bought the building anonymously. She'll never accept help from me directly. Eleanor felt the sting of those words, the reality of how Cole had watched her all these years, knowing how difficult her life had been, yet never able to reveal himself to her. She could hardly breathe as she read on, each entry digging deeper in her heart. November 30th, 1887. Bank foreclosing on her building despite my ownership. They found a legal loophole. I'm out of time, out of options. I have to act or lose her forever. Eleanor's chest tightened as the truth of it all hit her like a wave. The entire time, Cole had been planning this. He had been trying to protect her, trying to solve her problems, even when she didn't know she had them. He had done it all from the shadows, never asking for anything in return, never revealing the depth of his feelings. January 14th, 1888. Tomorrow, I marry Eleanor Marsh. She thinks it's a business arrangement. She doesn't know I've loved her for 12 years. That every acre I bought, every dollar I earned, was for her. I'll keep this secret. She deserves to choose freely, and she'd never choose me if she knew. Eleanor's tears spilled onto the pages as she finished the last entry. She had never known. She had never even imagined that Cole had been in love with her for so long, that all his actions, his distance, his coldness, had been motivated by a love so deep, so patient, that it had carried him through 12 long years. She had thought herself unworthy, thought that no one could ever truly love her, and yet here was the proof that someone had loved her all along. Someone who had built an empire not for himself, but for her. Her mind raced with the enormity of it all. She had never known how wrong she had been, how blind she had been to the love that had always been there. The truth was too much to bear, but it was the truth she needed. She wiped her tears, closing the journal, her hands shaking. She had to find him, had to tell him everything, because now she understood. Now she knew. She stood up, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope, and without another thought, she ran to the barn, determined to find Cole and tell him what she had discovered. The truth had come at last, and with it a chance for something she had never believed possible, a real, honest chance at love. The barn smelled of hay and leather, the familiar scent of hard work and sweat. As Eleanor ran through the darkened yard, her breath quick and shallow, she could hear her heart pounding in her chest, each beat reverberating through her like a drum. The barn loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the night sky. She reached it in what felt like a lifetime, the door creaking open as she stepped inside. Cole was there, his back turned to her, working on a horse's tack. He didn't hear her approach, and for a moment, she just stood there, watching him, the weight of the journal's revelations heavy in her hands. He had loved her all this time. He had watched her from afar, built an empire for her, all without her knowing, without expecting anything in return. And now, standing in the quiet of the barn, Eleanor knew everything she needed to know. She wasn't a charity case, a burden. She was the woman he had always wanted. And now she was finally ready to see him, to choose him. "Cole," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness. He turned quickly, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear, as though he had been expecting her but wasn't sure he could face her. "You read it," he said, his voice rough, thick with emotion. Eleanor nodded, clutching the journal tightly to her chest. "I did," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unspoken. Then, finally, Cole spoke, his voice breaking. "Eleanor," he stopped, his words faltering, and for a second, Eleanor thought he might run again, as he had so many times before. She couldn't let him do that. Not this time. "Where are you going?" she asked, stepping closer, her heart in her throat. He glanced away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Away," he muttered, "so you don't have to see me every day, be reminded of everything." Eleanor took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand tall. "No," she said, her voice firm. "Stop. Just stop running. I can't do this anymore, Cole. I can't keep pretending I don't know how you feel." He looked at her, his expression raw, his eyes dark with something that wasn't just guilt. It was regret. It was hope. "Why didn't you tell me 12 years ago?" she asked, her voice quieter now, softer. He looked at her, his face tightening with the weight of his answer. "I was nobody. You deserved a gentleman, someone educated, someone with more than what I had to offer. I never thought you'd look at me like that." She took a step closer to him, the distance between them finally starting to close. "You don't get to decide what I deserved," she said, her words steady. "I was the one who couldn't see you. I was too afraid, too broken to notice. But I noticed you, Cole. I always did." His eyes searched hers, as if looking for a truth that he couldn't quite grasp. "You remember?" he asked, his voice shaking. "You remember me?" Eleanor nodded, her chest tightening. "I remember you. I remember the harvest festival, the spooked horse." His eyes softened, and he took a step closer to her, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought you didn't care. I thought you didn't even notice me." She shook her head, a small smile breaking through the tension. "I did care, but I was too lost in my grief to let anyone in. I couldn't see what was right in front of me." She reached out, gently touching his arm. "You saved me that day, Cole, and I've spent 12 years wondering why no one else ever felt the same." He took a deep breath, his emotions raw, visible in his eyes. "I thought I had lost you forever," he said, his voice breaking. "I thought you'd never see me the way I saw you. And when I came back to town, I thought it was too late." Eleanor's heart swelled with emotion, and she reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "It's not too late," she whispered. "It was never too late. You were just waiting for me to see you, and I was waiting for you too." The air between them seemed to crackle with the energy of everything they had never said, everything they had kept locked away for so long. Eleanor looked at him, her heart racing, and her lips trembled as she whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore. I want this, Cole. I want you." The words were out before she could stop them, and for a moment, she thought she might have said too much. But Cole's expression softened, and he pulled her into him, his arms enveloping her with a warmth that spread through her like wildfire. He kissed her, his lips gentle at first, as though testing the waters, and then with a deep intensity that made her dizzy. It was a kiss that spoke of everything they had both held back, of years of silence, of longing, of regret, and of the love they had both been too scared to admit. When they finally pulled away, they were both breathless, their hearts beating in sync. "I don't want an arrangement, Eleanor," Cole said, his voice rough with emotion. "Neither do I," she replied, her voice steady now, sure of herself. "I want a real marriage, a real life with you." He looked at her, his face still filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands trembling slightly as they cupped her face. She smiled, her heart light for the first time in years. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. He kissed her again, this time deeper, more urgently, as though he could never get enough of her. When they pulled back, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness she had never thought she would see from him. "Then let me take you home," he said softly, lifting her off the ground as though she weighed nothing. "To our room, to our life, together." And with that, he carried her toward the house, toward the future they had both dreamed of but never thought possible. The door to the master bedroom closed softly behind them, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The truth had finally been spoken, and now they could begin the life they were always meant to share. The morning after, the light of dawn crept through the curtains, spilling soft golden beams across the room, and Eleanor awoke to the sensation of warmth at her side. She blinked, disoriented at first, unsure if what had happened the night before was real. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the early light, she turned and found Cole beside her, his strong, steady presence more comforting than she had ever imagined. He was already awake, lying on his back with his hands folded behind his head, watching her with an expression of quiet wonder, as though still unsure that this was real. His eyes met hers, and a smile tugged at the corners of his lips, soft and full of affection. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and this will be a dream," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, as though he couldn't quite believe this moment had finally arrived. Eleanor smiled in return, her heart full. She leaned in and kissed him gently on the lips, whispering, "Not a dream, a promise." It was a promise they both knew now they could keep. The quiet, tender moments of the morning passed in a peaceful silence, the two of them simply being, without the weight of past misunderstandings or unanswered questions hanging between them. For the first time, Eleanor felt entirely at home, in a way she had never known before. She ran her hand gently over the curve of his chest, the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers anchoring her to the reality of their love. She no longer felt like a burden or a charity case. She was his equal, his partner, and nothing could take that away. As they lay there, wrapped in the intimacy of the moment, the door creaked open, and in stepped Martha, the elderly housekeeper carrying a tray of warm food. She smiled knowingly at the sight of them, her eyes twinkling with a kind of affection that spoke volumes. "Shall I move Mrs. Brennan's things to the master bedroom?" she asked, her voice gentle and teasing. Cole chuckled softly, the sound rich and full of a kind of contentment that was rare for him. "Already done last night, Martha," he said, his arm draped around Eleanor as he spoke. "We won't be needing that room anymore." Martha's smile widened, and she gave him a knowing look, as though she had seen this coming from the very beginning. "Some of us knew how this would end," she remarked softly, placing the tray of food on the bedside table. Eleanor laughed, a full, genuine laugh that felt like it had been a long time coming, and glanced at Cole. For the first time, she felt free of all the burdens she had carried for so long. She was finally where she was supposed to be, and nothing else mattered. The day passed in a flurry of small, tender moments. The simple joys of breakfast together, of planning for the future, of speaking openly without fear or hesitation. It was a new life they were building, one with no more secrets, no more pretenses. Just love, honest and true. They spent the morning together, and as the hours passed, Eleanor found herself in awe of how easily everything was falling into place. The weight she had carried for years, the loneliness, the constant feeling of being overlooked, seemed to melt away with each passing moment. She no longer felt like an outsider, watching from the sidelines. She was part of something real, something beautiful, and for the first time, she believed in her own worth. Later that day, as they walked together into town, hand in hand, it was as though the world itself had shifted. There was a lightness to their step, a new energy that filled the air around them. As they entered the church for Sunday service, their hands clasped together, the transformation was clear. The whispers that had once followed Eleanor, the pity, the judgment, were gone. Instead, there was admiration, awe, and perhaps even a touch of envy. They were no longer a business arrangement, no longer an odd pairing of necessity. They were a couple, truly, and the town could see that. As they entered the congregation, all eyes turned toward them. But instead of the whispers of the past, there was something else, something warmer, something real. Mrs. Hartwell, seated near the front, looked at them with a satisfied smile, though Eleanor caught the glint of something else in her eye. It was as though Mrs. Hartwell had known all along that the arrangement would work, that this would be the outcome. Eleanor could hardly blame her for it. She had always tried to do what was best for everyone, even if her methods had been heavy-handed. But in the end, it was love that had triumphed, not obligation. During the social hour after the service, Eleanor stood to make a small speech, her heart swelling with gratitude and newfound strength. She looked out at the crowd, at the people who had watched her struggle, who had pityingly whispered about her status as the old maid of Blackwater Ridge. "I'd like to thank those who arranged my marriage," she began, her voice strong and clear. "You thought you were solving a problem, marrying off the old maid. But what you actually did was give me back something I lost 12 years ago." She paused, her eyes searching out Cole, who was standing beside her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "You gave me my heart," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me the one thing I never knew I needed, love. Real love. Thank you, Cole, for waiting all these years, for loving me when I couldn't see it." There was a ripple of surprise through the crowd, a hum of quiet acknowledgement that passed through the room like an electric current. And then Cole stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Eleanor is not a charity case," he said firmly, his eyes locking onto hers. "She is my wife, my choice, my partner. I'm a fortunate one. I've loved her for 12 years, and I'll love her for 1,200 more." And with that, he kissed her in front of the entire congregation, a kiss full of passion, of promise, of everything they had kept locked away for so long. It was a scandalous, beautiful moment, but it was theirs pure, unashamed, and true. The months passed, and life began to settle into a peaceful rhythm. A year later, Blackwater Ridge was celebrating the Harvest Festival once again, and Eleanor stood at the front of the crowd, teaching the children a traditional folk dance. The same dance she had taught so many years ago. As she led them through the steps, she noticed Cole standing off to the side, watching her with that same familiar look on his face, the one that had once made her heart race. But this time, he didn't stay in the shadows. This time, he walked over to her, his smile wide, and took her hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Brennan?" he asked, his voice light and teasing. She smiled, a true, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "I thought you'd never ask," she said, her voice full of laughter. And together, they danced, their feet moving in sync with the music, their hearts beating as one. The children watched, giggling at their antics, as Cole twirled Eleanor in a circle, the way they had done all those years ago. This time, though, there was no distance between them. There was only love. Eleanor's stomach fluttered as she rested her hand on her belly. She was pregnant, the new life they had created growing inside her, a symbol of their love and the future they were building together. "Do you remember standing here 12 years ago?" she asked him, her voice full of wonder. "Every detail," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I wish I could tell that scared girl it all works out." She smiled up at him, her heart full. "Tell her she just has to wait for the stubborn rancher to work up his courage," she teased, and Cole laughed. "Tell that rancher the girl loved him all along. She just didn't know it yet," he said softly. The photographer was setting up to take a picture of the festival, and they stood together in the same spot where they had once been so far apart. This time, though, they were together, radiant, happy, and full of life. The photographer snapped the shot, capturing the perfect moment. Eleanor and Cole, hand in hand, the love between them unmistakable. As they stood there, surrounded by the sounds of laughter and music, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace. This was her life now, the life she had never imagined but had always dreamed of. It had taken 12 years of waiting, of heartache and uncertainty, but in the end, it had been worth it. She was home, and with Cole by her side, she knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Was it worth it? Eleanor asked, her voice full of quiet wonder. 12 years of waiting. Cole kissed her forehead, his hand resting on her growing belly. Every single day, he said, his voice full of certainty, though I plan to spend the next 50 making up for lost time. She smiled, her heart full of love and laughter. Only 50, she teased. Forever, then, he replied, his voice full of promise. I'll love you forever. And with that, they kissed, the sound of the festival continuing around them, a new life, a new beginning unfolding in their arms. A family built on a love that waited. As they stood there, their child moving beneath their joined hands, Eleanor knew with all her heart that their love story wasn't just about waiting. It was about finding the courage to choose each other over and over again. Forever. The crowd of people swirled around them, but in that moment, they were the only two who mattered. And as they walked off together, hand in hand, their love story, the one that had begun so many years ago, continued to unfold, one beautiful, patient step at a time.